today. And several weeks back, Stan gave a sermon where he was saying, if you know something good to do, do it. I'm paraphrasing, but he was saying, don't just keep thinking about doing it. Don't keep waiting and seeing if somebody else will do it, but go ahead and do it. Help your brothers and sisters, serve others, rescue others. And in the same sermon, he talked about how there was an open call to give sermons. And we have it set up where every second Sunday, it's just sitting there available for any man who'd like to give a sermon. And then the 10-minute talk, like Josh gave this morning, set up on the fourth Sunday. And I thought to myself, I've been planning to write a sermon for a long time, but I kept making excuses. I kept saying, well, I don't want to monopolize the opportunities because I've done quite a few in the past. And other excuses, and that led to me just not doing it at all. I honestly don't even remember the last time I gave a sermon, but if you told me it was more than a year ago, I'd believe you. And let me take a moment to praise Ian Tilley, by the way, because that man goes after it. When the list went up to sign up for sermons, he signed up for 6 of the 12 months. Just before I even saw the list, it already had Ian's name on it 6 times. Now, to my shame, I originally thought poorly of Ian for this. I thought there's like 6 people that can give sermons, and he's taken half of the slots on the very first day. Other people are going to be discouraged from signing up. It's the wrong way to think about it. I should have praised his zeal. Because honestly, if you were sitting there and you were like, well, I want to give a sermon, but the only time I'm available in August is August, and Ian was already signed up for it, do you think he was going to be like, no, August is mine? He would have swapped with you, because Ian is about doing what's best. Well, now, with Ian not here, the list has been taken down. And that's to our shame. To my shame. The fact of the matter is, if Stan found a town somewhere else and he thought, I can be of more benefit to the kingdom working there, that's a better place for me to be a servant of God there, and him and Debbie went to that town, that we are completely equipped here to do the sermons ourselves. Between the various men that from time to time get up and give sermons, we could give all 100 sermons for the whole year. But when the list was taken down, there were only 2 names on it. There was one individual who had signed up, and Ian had signed up for 6 other spots. And Ian, of course, has since gone over to Weatherford and is helping them out with their preacher no longer being there. We could give 100 sermons, but we didn't sign up to give 12. So I'll make a commitment to you that I'll do better about that. I also want to remind that I do have an open offer to everyone, man, woman, or child, to everyone. I often re-give sermons. I'll find a sermon that's like by Mickey Galloway or Steve Cawthon or whoever, and I'll re-give it. I'll re-present it. There are a couple of reasons I do that. One, they're a lot more experienced than I am, write some pretty good sermons. But 2, I don't always have the best perspective on a topic. And sometimes looking at a topic from somebody else's position is actually something I think that will be more helpful to the congregation than looking at it from my position. And perspective is important. That's why we have 4 Gospels, right? Why do we have 4 Gospels and not one Gospel? It's 4 different ways of looking at the same thing. Each of those can help you in different ways. Each of those serves its own purpose. The fact of the matter is, when Dennis gives a sermon on a topic, and it's a topic that Stan's given a sermon on before, it's a very different sermon. He's got different experiences, different perspectives, and that can help give us all different insights. At one point I was teaching the high school class, and it was all boys. This was a long time ago. Might have been 20 years ago. And I was encouraging them to give invitation talks, the little 5-minute talks we have on Wednesdays. I was encouraging them to give those, but I said, but you know what, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, go ahead and write one up, and I'll give it. Now obviously, I have to agree with whatever you wrote up. I'm not just going to read whatever you write. But go ahead and do that, and I'll read it. Another time I was teaching the high school class, this was later, and there were boys and girls in the class. I had them, we were studying Revelation, and I had them write a letter to Westside, right? You've got the letter to the Laodiceans, you've got the letter to Sardis, everyone. And so I had them write a letter to Westside. And that was interesting. As, out of the mouths of babes and things like that, and it can be kind of condemning if somebody like that calls you on the carpet about something. And I took all those. I forget how many were in the class. 5 or 6 were in the class. And I took all of those and I compiled them into a single letter, and I presented it as a sermon then. And so I told them, and I told the congregation at the time, and I'm telling you now, that I'd be open, and am open, to presenting ideas or a sermon outline that you might write up. Again, with the caveat that I have to agree with it. And actually, I've been working on this sermon for a long time. For months I've been working on this sermon. Way too long, actually. And I was mentioning at the little Starbucks get-together on Sunday mornings some of the topics, and already somebody's giving me a sermon outline. So now that I'm done giving this one, I'm going to start working on the next one. But then I could start working on yours. But I'm getting distracted. I've practically given a whole sermon before I even got to my sermon. One of the reasons I put off writing this sermon, this particular sermon, is because of the broadcast nature of sermons. It's something that I particularly find challenging. I'm worried about saying something wrong. Not something false, something true, but just saying it a way that isn't helpful, or maybe even is harmful. I've certainly done that in the past. I'll admit to you, I got way more nervous writing this sermon than I have in a long time, probably because I haven't given a sermon in a long time. I find the classes easier than sermons, and I find one-on-one conversations even easier than that. Because when you're talking like this, I've given sermons before where I've had 2 or 3 people come up and tell me that it really, really helped them. But then it hurt 20 or 30 people. Obviously, it wasn't my intention. So when you give a talk like this, you have to think about the group as a whole and how you can feed the group as a whole. And I find that challenging. It's easier in a one-on-one conversation to tailor it, to be all things to all people, and to approach a topic in a way that you know will help that person specifically. And I've mentioned before, I think this is my 9th sermon now, where I've written out the entire sermon, word for word. Not because I'm going to sit here and read it to you, but just so I can glance down occasionally and keep myself on topic, not ad-lib too much. Ad-libbing is where I get myself in trouble. And so I don't get distracted. Justin, didn't you just say you get distracted? You said you got distracted and did a whole nother sermon before your sermon. I did, but I got distracted while I was writing it. And then I wrote down that distraction, and then I recited that distraction to you without getting further distracted. Why? Why am I doing all that craziness? Because I love y'all. I want to be careful when I give a message. It says that teachers will have a harsher judgment. And it's because of just the tragedy of leading anyone astray. Giving a sermon is not the time to voice new ideas that just popped into your head. The topic of today's sermon is being more aware of where your pendulum is. What in the world do I mean by that? Well, we talk about these cycles in history. We talk about the pendulum swinging. It swings back and forth, and you just see these cycles throughout history. An example of that would be like fashion. Like I was talking about my son being talked to by someone at school about athletic shorts, and he's always wearing shorts that are twice as long as everyone else's shorts and stuff like that. Well, you look back from like the 1950s going up into the 70s, the early 80s, and the shorts just kept getting shorter until they were insanely short. Like the NBA shorts of the late 70s and early 80s were insanely short. By the time I was playing sports in the late 90s, they were long. They were down to your calves again. Big old baggy, weird looking shorts that I now am told are dad shorts, and that my son will not be caught dead in them. But now they're getting short again. So much so that when Jason and I were out trying to buy shorts because he's going to Florida College summer camp, that's how they advertise them. You see the markers above the different racks of them. And it'll be like 7-inch inseam, 5-inch inseam. That's what the ad is. Because, what are you looking for? What are you looking for that's hip and trendy at the time? The pendulum will swing again. Long shorts will be in again sometime, I don't know, 2030s or something. Swings back and forth. So society has these pendulums that swing back and forth. We do too individually. I mentioned being hesitant about giving a sermon. Well, another reason is where my pendulum is for that. How likely am I to give a sermon? Am I very likely to give a sermon, or is it swung back this way and I'm very unlikely to give a sermon? I mean, when I am all the way over here, I don't even want to talk in class, much less get up here in front of everybody. Have all y'all looking at me. When I'm all the way over here, I'll talk all the time. I'll talk in class. I'll give every Wednesday night invitation. I'll give a sermon a month. I'll talk all the time. Well, right now I'd say I'm right about here. So, why? What sends my pendulum over that direction? Well, there can be a lot of things. There can be stress. I could be tired. I could be peopled out. I'm an introvert. I could just be like, I've had enough people. Could be persecution from the last time I did it. Could be I made a mistake the last time I did it. But it's good to know why your pendulum is where it is. But what I said the topic of the sermon was knowing where it is. And why is it important to know where it is? Well, for one, your pendulum may not be in a good place. It's not good for my sermon-given pendulum, or even my talking in class-given pendulum, to be over here. It's not good. Knowing that it's there and being conscious of it being there gives me an opportunity to do something about it. To work on getting it back where it belongs, which is somewhere over here. Probably not all the way up here, but somewhere over here is where it belongs. But that takes work. It shouldn't have taken me more than a year to give another sermon. It shouldn't have taken me 3 or 4 months to write this sermon. And in fact, I had it written down on my calendar that I was going to give this sermon at the beginning of August. And when the middle of August came around and Stan said he was going to be gone this weekend, I signed up immediately as a means of forcing my pendulum this direction. As a means of, well, now you're signed up, buddy, you're going to have to write that sermon. You have to work at it. You have to work at being the person that you need to be. And in order to do that, you have to be conscious of yourself. You have to look at the different aspects of yourself. Yeah, my sermon-given pendulum, okay, that's one of them. But there are tons of pendulums. There are tons of things about, like, how is my prayer life? How is my study life? How am I doing with hospitality? How am I doing with visiting the fatherless and the widows? How am I doing with all these different aspects of service? How am I doing with evangelism? Knowing where you are makes it easier to get yourself where you need to be. Another reason to know where your pendulums are is that where it is may put you at risk of things. You know, what's the risk when my sermon-given pendulum is way over here? It's that I'm not giving sermons. Okay, well, yeah. But it's meaning that I'm not serving like I should. It's meaning that I'm not, well, that I'm neglecting my responsibilities that have been given to me by God. You know, think about it like, think I'm a 3-talent man. We've got the parable of the talents, and the 5 he went and bought and sold and such, and he got 5 more. The 1-talent man just buried it. So if I'm a 3-talent man, and the master comes back and goes, well, I bought and sold and I traded with these 2 talents and I buried the other one in the dirt. Is he going to be happy with me? That's not what he's looking for. He's looking for me to take what I've been given and to be a profitable servant with what I've been given. So what are the dangers when it swings all the way over here? I'm in a very sermon-giving mood. What's the dangers there? Well, one is that I do take opportunities away from others, and that we start getting singular perspectives, which is not good. But another is that my excitement and ambition about giving the sermons outweighs my excitement about giving good sermons, about preparing them. And so I talk more, but I have less preparation. I have less quality. I spend less time thinking about crafting a good message and less time thinking about what the congregation needs at any given time. As I mentioned, every person or group of people have different pendulums, a lot of different pendulums. Congregations have pendulums, and they try to swing back and forth, and only through the work that I was talking about do we keep the pendulums where they belong, because it turns out that our service to God isn't supposed to ebb and flow like that, right? And you have to work to keep the pendulum up there. The pendulum doesn't want to stay up there. The pendulum wants to swing. And I'm not saying that we can't let things change. We've got a lot of liberties and we've got a lot of flexibilities. I'll give an example. We're called to sing, to pray, to preach, to commune. But how much emphasis do we place on each of those things? We've got liberty with that. Some places put a lot more emphasis on the Lord's Supper than we do. There have been times here at this congregation where it was just standard. Prayers were very, very long and detailed. They're a little bit shorter now. They're not as short as they had been. There was a time there for a while where they were very short. That's not necessarily wrong. Right now our pendulum is swung way towards singing. We do a lot of singing right now. We've got singing nights on Wednesday night. We've got singing classes on a Wednesday night. We just had singing this morning. We've got our triannual singings. It's swung way over towards singing right now. In the future, it'll swing the other way. There'll be less singing. Maybe we'll have more of a focus on Bible studies. Maybe we'll have more of a focus on prayer. A more broad pendulum that congregations and really society as a whole has is the kind of classic liberal versus conservative pendulum, where you see society swinging back and forth, more conservative times, more liberal at times as you look over the history of the world. And we often talk about that in terms of West Side's pendulum being affected by societies. But society's moving more liberal. And I don't mean liberal and conservative like political parties. I'm not talking about that. Society is in general, again, it's not everyone, but in general, society is moving so far in that direction that they want liberty from God altogether. Not even particularly the Christian God. They want liberty from any concept of God. You see that borne out in people asking for freedoms that are actually harmful. And so that pulls at the congregation. But again, the point of this lesson is not to talk about where we don't want our pendulum to be, but to know where it is. So where do you think our pendulum is? On the liberal to conservative pendulum, where do you think it is? In the first draft of this sermon, I was actually going to call on people. I had Dennis and Tommy's names written in my sermon to call on them specifically. That's why I edit more now. That is a really bad idea, to go calling on people just cold like that in the middle of a sermon. So I'm going to give you my answer and take my word for it for right now, and we'll get back to it. But I would say, liberal to conservative, that we're here-ish. A little more than halfway through the conservative side is where we are. And thinking about that, and think about the questions that we were looking at with regard to me when we were talking about my sermon giving pendulum. You know, what are the dangers of where we might be, and is where we are a good place? Well, we know that we shouldn't be here. 100% liberty. That's just everybody doing whatever in the world they want. It's 100% freedom. No rules. Everyone just does what they want. We know we shouldn't be there. And we know that I'm just going to smack the mic. We know we shouldn't be over here, all the way over here. Because over here is 0% liberty. Over here, we're binding things that God hasn't bound. We've gone too far. But the natural question to ask after you look at both of those, so what about right in the middle? Why isn't the middle the place to be? You've got 50-50. You've got some liberties. You've got some things that are bound. Isn't that where we belong? Why isn't that the right answer? Well, it's because it's not a 50-50 situation. We don't have a 50-50 situation in this life. We have a God-focused situation in this life. And God has bound things. There are things that God has bound that we are not at liberty to unbind. There are things that God has loosed that we're not at liberty to bind. that limits our liberty. And it's interesting because you look at the way that things are described in the Bible, you look at things like the law of liberty, or that the yoke is light. But it's kind of like what we talked about in class, where it said, hate your father and your mother. It was a question of relativity. Your love for God has to be preeminent. Compared to that, your love for father and mother is insignificant. What's the idea here? Comparing to the burden of sin, the yoke of Christ is light. Comparing to the end result of sin, this is a law of liberty. This is a law that gives you true freedom. Not freedom from God, but freedom in God. So in thinking about that, I was actually going to make some PowerPoints, but I decided they were goofy. Thinking about that, I drew a PowerPoint that had the goal being about halfway through the conservative side. We're not 50-50, we're right in the middle of where God wants us to be. We're right on that straight and narrow. By the fourth draft of this sermon, I began to question my pendulum metaphor. I also started thinking about how many of the younger people have even ever seen a pendulum clock. And like any metaphor, it shouldn't be taken too far. It's like when sometimes we'll try to shove too much into a parable. And I've seen it happen with the parable of the sower probably more than anything. People will start talking about fertilizer and things. It's like, Jesus didn't talk about fertilizer. You guys are making things up. I remember one time I was talking to Rick Hightower because he was talking about Paul planted and Apollos watered. And he goes, I think I'm a plow. It's like, that is not part of that passage. Try to take things a little too far sometimes. If you hang with me, I think you'll get my point. And I am running out of time to make my point. If our pendulum is to be right in the middle on this side, and we're slightly further right than that, what does that mean? What are the dangers there? Because we talked about the dangers that I had a moment ago. Well, first of all, it makes sense that we would be there because we feel the drag downward. You can call it gravity or whatever you want. You can call it society pulling us this direction, but we feel it. And so we're putting in that work. We're pushing against it. And that puts us at danger of pushing too far. You get those cases you're trying to push a vehicle and it's difficult to get it up over the top of the hill, and then you get it up over the top of the hill and it's difficult to stop it. Well, you think about that narrow way, it's very easy to slip either to the left or the right and fall off of the narrow way. We see examples of that in the Bible. I won't go into them all, but you think about Jesus saying there would be many that say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we do all these good things in your name? And he'll be like, no, you didn't stay on the path. I mean, you're doing these things, and those things weren't bad, but you didn't stay on the path, so it's all for naught. Another danger of pushing too far is that when you begin to cause that separation, people feel the momentum. And people start to be comfortable with the momentum. And that's why you see people that have drifted continue to drift. We think about that a lot of times when we're talking about tending towards the liberal, we call it a slippery slope, right? But if we're on the narrow and we can fall either way, either side can be a slippery slope. The Pharisees had fallen down a slippery slope, and they kept on going. They weren't liberal by any means. Sometimes that momentum manifests with an entire congregation. Sometimes it manifests with individuals. But it always leads to believing false ideas and false principles. And believing false ideas and false principles hurts you because it leads to false conclusions and false paths. The place I'm concerned about this, and I thought about making a whole sermon about just all the places I'm concerned about this, but I decided to just talk about one topic, is how we talk about the challenges that we have with immodesty and temptation related to that. And the reason I'm concerned about it is because I've seen what it's done to people. I've seen how it's hurt people. And that wasn't the intention, obviously. It was not the intention at all. But it was a result. And it's not unique to Westside by any means. It's something that is pretty common across conservative churches. And this is a delicate topic. It's another reason I took forever writing this sermon, because it's a delicate topic. But it's an important one because it's talking about souls. When we talk about it, when we talk about immodesty and the temptations related to immodesty, we often talk about the visual stimuli for guys. And we emphasize that very heavily. And we tell the ladies that they have to be careful about being a stumbling block to their brothers. And we tell the guys that it's a burden that they'll face because of their nature. And I understand the intent. The intent is good. There's a legitimate danger there. People need to be warned about it. It's important. But it kind of goes back to what I was saying about the challenge of broadcasting in a sermon, where I could say something in a way that's really helpful to a few people that half the congregation doesn't even understand what I just said. That's not a good thing to do from a sermon. And it's very, very hard. It's very, very hard. And especially when you talk about topics that are a little more taboo, people are hesitant to talk about it. People get ideas, and those ideas germinate and grow inside their heads, and they never talk out loud about them. And I've seen cases where when they do get talked out loud about, the person that gave the sermon is like, that's not what I meant at all. I definitely worry about that. I get worried when I give sermons about that. And so these things can lead people down false paths. I've had young men in this congregation talk to me about being destined to lust. And that's the conclusions they drew based on the study they had had and based on the talking in class and such at church. A young lady at this congregation said it took her 30 years to realize that she was allowed to wear jeans that fit. I'm not saying tight jeans, I'm saying that she was wearing jeans that were 2 sizes too big baggy jeans, because she didn't want to even be close to being guilty of tempting a brother. And that's a good intention, but it's a misunderstanding of the situation. And it's laying guilt in a place that it doesn't belong. But both men and women are coming away from the teaching believing that all men are constantly on a precarious cliff, and that a woman could accidentally push them over the edge with the slightest behavior, and that she'd be guilty if she did so. This is a hard sermon to give. I'm looking at my notes here where I've just got whole paragraphs slashed out, because I do want to be careful. Another danger of our emphasis is that it focuses on the typical. And that's obviously what you're going to do. But if you always talk about what is most typical, then the people that are not most typical end up heading down other false paths, end up having other misconceptions. People come to think about, well, those are the cases that exist, the ones that we talk about, and they discount other cases. Because even if we accept that men are more visually stimulated than women, and there's definitely debate among scientific studies about that, but even if we accept that, it's a generality. People are individuals. Like Stan's mentioned before that he's never going to be tempted by alcohol. Not a thing. Some Christians are very tempted by alcohol. So the same thing holds here. There's some men that for visual stimuli, they will never have a temptation. And there are women who do. I don't remember if I ever said this from the pulpit before, but I gave a sermon many, many years ago. And in it there was a topic of pornography. And afterwards, 3 women came up to me and told me that in the past they had struggled with pornography. And that's a very taboo subject in general, but the way society teaches it, or treats it rather, not teaches it, the way society treats it, and very much so the way the conservative church treats it, it's more taboo for women than it is for men. First of all, we need to be careful about any sin being taboo. If talking about a sin, not obviously the sin's taboo, but talking about a sin, if talking about a sin is taboo, then it leaves those people nowhere to go to lean on their brothers and sisters. I'm not saying that we do it in sermons. I'm not saying we do it up in front of everyone and children and everyone, but they need somewhere to go. And that somewhere could be a men's class or a women's class, or it could be one-on-one or whatever. But it has to be something where they can feel open about that. 3 different women came up to me, and that was just the ones that were bold enough to come up to me. Our teaching slants towards the male perspective. That's likely a byproduct of men being the ones that are giving the sermons. You know, one of the reasons that elders are supposed to be married is because elders, and all husbands for that matter, should be leaning on the wisdom and experience of their wives. But it's just as real a problem for women. And to talk about it in a skewed way leads down false paths. I mentioned to one of the older men of the congregation that those women had approached me, and he asked me if we had an epidemic. I thought that was interesting. He had in his mind that women struggling with those things was a rare exception. So rare, he didn't expect to see it in his entire lifetime. Very dangerous. It doesn't leave a situation that's open to help one another. And that's a false path. To describe it as that rare or to discount it, which I've also seen done. And that makes women who do struggle with it feel like they're so broken or dirty that they dare not speak of it to anyone. I'm using this example. There are many other examples. Many other examples. And alive, it's hard to talk about this stuff. It's probably why we find it so challenging to preach about this stuff. It is very hard. All teaching is about principles and application. Our approach to modesty and nakedness has to be the same as it is to everything else. Anytime we approach a topic or a sin, it's all the same idea under the covers. You've heard from this pulpit the example of there was this Christian, and they were rather overweight, and they wore a swimsuit to public pools, and when they were confronted about it, they said, nobody's going to be lusting after me. You know, is their body image. They're like, no, it's not an issue. Not an issue. No lust is going on there. And the response was that you don't know that, and it's not your call to make. And that's true, but it's not quite the right attitude to have. Yes, we don't want to be a stumbling block for someone. That's true, but that's not the initial motivation for covering our nakedness. The initial motivation is that it's a command from God. And the initial motivation is that it is shameful. And when you expose yourself, whether or not somebody feels lust, you should feel shame. You've done something, you've sinned, you've done something shameful. And you need to look at that as disgusting. Because sin is disgusting. Not because nakedness is disgusting or your body is disgusting. Sin is disgusting. And it's so important that we get in our minds that all sin is disgusting. If we can keep that view of it. I've described before the white fleece and it gets tar on it, or it gets manure on it, or something like that. Or your clothes do. The same way that would bring disgust, that's how we need to think about the blemish of sin on our lives. And that blemish comes whether or not anyone stumbles or not. On the other side of the equation, we need to be teaching and supporting one another when it comes to the challenges of lust. That's certainly true. People need to feel open to come to individuals and ask for help, ask for support. It's a challenge for everyone, men, women, old and young. We're all individuals. It'll be more of a challenge for some than for others. But we can't walk into it with a preconception. And we talk about that sometimes about spreading the gospel. We tend to always use the Harley driver with tattoos. I don't know why that's the guy we talk about, but we tend to go, you see a guy on a Harley with a bunch of tattoos, and you think, well, he's not going to be receptive to the gospel. Well, you don't know. And the fact of the matter is, you don't know the heart of man unless someone shares it with you. You don't know the struggles somebody's going through unless they share it with you. And we have to look at the global nature of problems in order to be an open place, to be that support network that we're called to be. I don't want to go too deep into it, but it's interesting to me that we don't have long discussions about how to fill yourself in a way that you don't leave room for sin. I think having more discussions like that in class settings, but also in smaller groups or one-on-one would be helpful. It's kind of like that thing where it says if you cast out the demons and then they come back later and find it all clean and swept, and they come back in and invite more of their friends, and it's worse than when you started. We need to talk about how to fill our minds, not just with the Word. We tend to talk about that a lot, about filling our minds with the Word, and that's good, that's important. But you have to fill your mind specifically with things about the things that you find challenging. It's like I was talking in the class about when you know you're going to have a challenge, say, talking to the high school kids, when you know you're going to have a challenge because you're going to be approached by your friends to go and do this or that or something that's inappropriate, that you prepare yourself, that you think about that situation, that you have an answer ready. And the same type of thing happens inside our own brains, where we have conversations with ourselves, and we need to have an answer ready for ourselves. so that we can do things like Job and make a covenant with ourselves. Well, I'm over time. This is very heavy. It's simultaneously deeper than I would have cared to go into this topic, and not as deep as the topic needs to be gone into. And maybe there's somebody more able to go deeper into it. But I do worry about the opportunities that I've squandered and how many opportunities are in my future. And I'm more kept up at night by the things that I haven't said than the things I have said. This is one example, one topic of one specific pendulum. There's many others. There's lots of cases where I've seen conservative churches, I've seen Westside, where there's we're going to do this because it's better safe than sorry, and over time that conservative pressing ends up becoming a rule. And people, young people, I mean, the most recent example was Amos and David. I was asking them about, how would you approach a conversation with a classmate about topic X? Doesn't matter what the topic was. And they immediately approached it with something that was just false. Like their conclusion was true. Like whatever we were talking about, creation versus evolution or something like that. But their argument was false. Their way of deriving the authority was false. And that's really dangerous. Because if you learn a false way to derive authority, or you learn a false way to get to conclusions, then that spreads to other things in your life. And you start developing other false conclusions that lead you further off of the path, most likely without you realizing it. But if we always teach the principle and the application, then we'll not only teach the specific thing we're talking about, but we'll also teach the wisdom of how to draw those conclusions. Well, I was up till after 3 writing and rewriting and editing this thing. Having gone through it now, I feel like I should have done more, but sometimes you can do too much. I was trying to get this message bite-sized and poignant. As I said, I'm more haunted by things that I haven't said than by things that I have said. Because I often have thought in the past that now's not the right time, or maybe I'm not the right person to talk about it, or I haven't found the right way to say it, or maybe I should just give it time and it'll work itself out. But we don't have time. We have so little time. And our behavior earns interest. We sung earlier that song, Apples in the Seed, right? And we see the interest that earns over time. How I believe one of the verses says, maybe you try to spread the gospel to however many people, and you only convert one, but then down the line that one leads to 1,000 other people who have been converted. You don't know. And it's the same way with all of our service. It's the same way with our encouragement. It's the same way with our chastisements. It's the same way with dispensing knowledge or wisdom. It's the same way with hospitality and everything. Early and often it builds over time to a greater good. And when you look at the people that didn't become a Christian until really late in life, they regret that they weren't a Christian earlier. Yes, because of the relationship with God and Christ, but also because all of those missed opportunities to do good that they're never going to get back. Or you see somebody who left and returns, and they regret that time that they lost for the exact same reasons. So the point of this lesson is, well, as abstract as I was about getting here, it's that you need to be self-aware, that you need to think about yourself. You can think about the congregation too, but you need to think about yourself and where your various pendulums are, where you've leaned too far towards self and too far away from Christ, where you've leaned too far towards apathy, where you've swung to a place that you ought not be and can make a correction. It's very easy to get distracted. Josh was talking about that earlier. You get to the end of the day and you're like, I didn't get anything done today. You can do that with a week. You can do that with a month. You can do that with a life. And if you don't have the dedication that we talked about in class, you're not picking up your cross daily, you can regress to the point that you are nowhere near the benefit of the kingdom that you could have been. And if you aren't examining yourself, if you aren't comparing yourself to Christ, if you aren't considering yourself, you could end up becoming counterfeit and not even realizing it. So if you've slipped off the narrow way, or if you've never started imitating Christ, if you just need prayers or anything at all, please come forward while we stand and sing.